momentous occasion as we celebrate our inaugural summit weekend with the topic Uncomfortable Conversations. Let us keep in mind the importance to encourage the practice of interfaith relations to mend differences and promote mutual understanding in our society. This is very important. At Claremont Lincoln University, we are committed to moving from interfaith dialogue to interfaith action. What is interfaith action? Interfaith action is an emerging specialty that equips students with the critical skills to work in various professional roles where they will need to be effective in identifying solutions to new problems in post-secular contexts or in contexts where religion is sacred in the 21st century. In order to promote a culture of peace through interfaith engagement, it requires that practitioners comprehend the value in coexistence. Coexistence as an action is an uncomfortable practice and reality. It denotes change and a shift in posture from distance to center. We welcome this morning Susan Katz Miller, who will help us to understand better the importance of interfaith relations, cross-cultural engagement, and most importantly, the kaleidoscope of religious identity. Author and journalist Susan Katz Miller is a former journalist, staff reporter for Newsweek magazine, and the author of Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family. This exciting new book chronicles the rise of a controversial new grassroots movement, interfaith families choosing to celebrate both religions. Miller's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, Christian Science Monitor, NPR's All Things Considered, and elsewhere. She is a Brown University graduate, and is an active journalist and blogger. She will speak today on the topic, Our Interfaith Future, Fluid and Complex. After her talk, she will join me for a one-on-one chat where we will have the opportunity today to ask her a few questions. Without further ado, Susan Katz Miller.
So a rabbi and a minister walk into a bar and sit down in a booth together and plan an interfaith wedding, or an interfaith baby welcoming, or an interfaith coming of age ceremony, or an interfaith funeral. This, of course, is not a joke. It's a shorthand description of this complex religious landscape that we're living in the 21st century. I want to dive right in and interact with you a little bit just to make you more uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you, if you dare, to raise your hand if you are in or have ever been in an interfaith marriage or partnership, or an interdenominational relationship, or perhaps a religious, non-religious relationship. Okay, now keep your hands up. I want to add in everybody who has an interfaith relationship like that in their parents' or their grandparents' generation, or among their children or grandchildren, or has a sibling or an aunt or an uncle in an interfaith relationship. Everybody. And now let's add in everybody who's, say, Christian or Jewish, but also practices Buddhism or another religion. Okay, it's all of us, right? Unless you're coming perhaps first or second generation from a country which has a much more singular faith identity, or unless you live in a really remote area of the United States that's still entirely Christian, you are part of what I am increasingly seeing as this huge interconnected interfaith family, that we are all interconnected in this way. I want to briefly tell you my interfaith family story, because I think when we engage on this sometimes uncomfortable, challenging conversation about interfaith families and their role in interfaith activism, it's important that you know where somebody's coming from. People have their agendas. I'm sure I have one too. But this is my story. the rabbi and the minister sitting in that bar, that was my rabbi and my minister about 25 years ago planning my wedding. I'm Jewish, my husband is Protestant, or that's one shorthand for our identities, but we'll get into that later. And 3 days after that rabbi and minister co-officiated at our wedding, we moved to West Africa. Now, I had left a prestigious job in the Washington Bureau as a Newsweek reporter, frankly, to follow my husband. And I was having a bit of an identity crisis. And I got to West Africa, and I realized I was a nice Jewish girl married to a Protestant boy working for a Catholic organization in a Muslim country. And my head was exploding a little bit. I remember walking off the plane in Dakar and being hit by this wall of tropical humidity, and I was wearing a heavy leather jacket from Banana Republic in New York. And I remember peeling off that jacket and thinking, this is a layer that I don't need anymore. I'm heading into something completely new, something more global. I don't know what it is. By the end of 3 years in Senegal, I had learned to wrap my waist in African print cloth. I had learned to bargain for a mango in Wolof, which is the predominant language there. And my husband and I had settled into a pattern of celebrating Jewish holidays, Christian holidays, and Muslim holidays with our Sufi friends and neighbors in Senegal. Now, fast forward a few years, and we ended up moving to northeastern Brazil for 3 years. Now, Brazil, you may know, is the largest Catholic country in the world, and there we were immersed in some of the really inspiring aspects of Catholicism, Catholic social teaching, liberation theology, opposition to dictatorships in Latin America. But what's interesting in northeastern Brazil in terms of religion is that there's a huge influence of the Afro-Brazilian rites and rituals and practices brought over from the Yoruba culture in West Africa. And a lot of northeastern Brazilians across the color spectrum simultaneously practice Catholicism and these Yoruba-based rites. And they don't see any conflict in that. So I think that both of those overseas experiences in different ways fed into the decision that my husband and I ultimately made to raise our interfaith children with an interfaith education. But to understand that decision, we really have to go back a generation. I want you to picture a rainy night at Boston's Logan Airport in 1953. And there's one taxi left at the stand. And there's a man and a woman walking towards it from 2 different directions. And luckily for me, they got in together, because the man, who's Jewish, is my father, and the woman, who's Protestant, is my mother. For the next 7 years, they really wrestled with whether they could get married. It was not common in the 1950s. There really were no templates for this. They didn't know how to do it. But they were in love, and after 7 years, they took that leap of faith. And my mother then became one of the great first examples of what's now sometimes called an all-but conversion mother of a Jewish family. So she sometimes calls herself a common law Jew. So she put aside her religious practice, and she learned how to make fluffy matzo balls, and she studied Hebrew with our rabbi, and she shepherded all 4 children through the bar and bat mitzvah process. And I think that the decision my parents made to choose one religion for their interfaith family was a great decision. It's a decision that works for a lot of families, but it doesn't work for all of them. And what I write about in my book is the idea that any pathway that you choose as an interfaith family, whether it's one religion or the other, or both, or none, or all religions, or a third new religion, you're never going to completely erase the interfaithness of that child or of that family. And that's what I experienced growing up. Even though I was given a singular religious label, I still knew on some level that I was an interfaith child. And part of what I am writing about is the idea that we need to claim that interfaithness as a positive and not as a problem, which is the way that it's really been put forth in the dominant discourses. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is that a lot of the previous literature on interfaith marriage was so negative, and it didn't reflect my experience at all. And I wanted to see my more positive experience and that of other people that I knew reflected in the literature. And that's part of what motivated me. So, what I see is that the idea that you're part of an interfaith family can actually be a powerful lens that aids in interfaith dialogue, interfaith action, bridge building, peacemaking. And I am trying hard to get that idea across, but it's not always a comfortable conversation. Because under the traditional interfaith dialogue template, you have someone of one religion over here and someone of another religion over here, and they come together and they talk and they shake hands, and then they go back to their silos, changed only in that they are deepened in their silo, right? Those of us who are dancing between the silos full time make people very uncomfortable. But we can't help it, because at least for me, I feel like I was born there. It's not that I'm choosing to be provocative or to make people uncomfortable. This is where I began. And I'm interested in owning that and making it positive. I'm not really interested in the kind of interfaith dialogue where the individuals claim to represent singular, pure, authentic religious traditions that have never had any connection to other religious traditions, because I don't believe that those religious traditions exist. All religious traditions are evolving, are co-evolving, respond to each other through history. And as an interfaith child, I'm particularly aware of that co-evolution. So, my three-generation interfaith family, which felt very unique growing up, because I'm sort of the tip of this demographic iceberg of interfaith families coming up. My parents intermarried a generation before most people did. So I felt kind of isolated and alone. But now, I'm no longer alone. Pew Research has found something like 36% of all people have a partner or a spouse of another faith or another denomination. If we talk purely about faith and not about different Christian denominations, it's a slightly smaller percentage, but what's clear is that that percentage has been rising. And Pew has described this great religious flexibility and fluidity that we're all living with. Now, this is not just in the US. This is a global phenomenon. So I am now engaged with people in Europe, for instance, who are writing about and supporting primarily Christian Muslim interfaith families, because the Muslim population in Europe is older and more assimilated, and there's been more intermarriage there. So there's a lot of thinking going on about how to support those families. In Asia, I'm in contact with, engaged with a lot of people thinking about Hindu-Muslim intermarriage and how that works in various countries. Intermarriage is still illegal in a lot of countries because you can only have a religious marriage in a lot of countries, in the Middle East, in Asia, elsewhere. If there's no civil marriage, then interfaith marriage becomes effectively illegal. So I'm involved with advocacy on those issues. Here in the US, though, most of what's been written, most of the focus has been from the Jewish community, because interfaith marriage has been perceived of as threatening this very small religious minority, fear of assimilation. But Pew Research a year and a half ago came out with a very large study of the Jewish American landscape. And the statistic that popped out to me in there was that 25% of intermarried Jewish parents are raising children partly Jewish and partly something else. So these are my people. They're people doing both. One of the, for me, interesting and for some people very scary statistics is that that's actually a larger cohort than those raising children exclusively Jewish. That's only about 20%. And raising them both is 25%. Now, I would argue that you cannot raise an interfaith child exclusively Jewish, no matter how hard you try. But that's a whole other conversation that we could have if you want. What that told me was that the families doing both are no longer exotic or marginal. They can't be ignored. I mean, this is something that religious institutions have tried to say, pick a religion, just pick one. Even if you pick the other guys, fine, but you can't do both. And the reality is that families are doing both. For whatever reason, they can't pick one. Often it's because both partners are religious. There's been a myth that you wouldn't try to do both unless you were not very serious. But in fact, a lot of families are serious about both, and that's why they're doing both. Because neither parent is willing to just cast aside their religion the way my mother did, frankly. What I did for this book was to chronicle a grassroots movement, which is rising up, of these interfaith families that have found each other. And I focused on 3 major cities, New York, Chicago, and Washington, where there are robust programs that have evolved to teach interfaith education to interfaith children. In each of those cities, there are programs now with over 100 interfaith children learning both religions together in formal programs that would look like a Sunday school to you. My 2 children, who are now 17 and 20, were raised in the program in Washington, D.C. And each of these 3 programs arose independently, spontaneously, but they're loosely interconnected now. And they share a philosophy, a strategy, in which in every classroom, every Sunday school classroom for every age, you have a Jewish educator and a Christian educator co-teaching that classroom. And what you get there is a source from each of those 2 religions when people have children have questions about the rituals or the philosophies. But you also have those co-teachers modeling that respectful engagement with each other in front of the classroom. And in some of these programs, in Washington and Chicago, parents do most of the teaching, so you might even have co-teachers in a classroom who are a married couple, a Jewish and a Christian spouse together teaching a classroom. So they're modeling not just respect, but love between those 2 religions. The New York area groups have taken a different tack. They also have Jewish and Christian teacher in each classroom, but they hire seminarians as their teachers, primarily from Union Theological Seminary, Progressive Christian Seminary, and Jewish Theological, which is the conservative Jewish seminary, in New York. And they're across the street from each other, as you probably know, and have relationships. But it's interesting, so these seminarians are bringing, deep philosophical, academic credentials to teaching there. And then they go out and become clergy in their respective religions after having had this experience of interacting with interfaith children in an interfaith education classroom, which I think is interesting. I do focus on Jewish and Christian intermarriage in my book because that's my experience, and because that is these formal programs that have grown up are all those 2 religions. But I have a chapter in the book of Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, other interfaith families all raising their children with both of whatever their 2 religions are. So I do see this movement as a template that could be helpful. There are obviously different benefits and drawbacks to any 2 set of religions that you put together in a family. But I'm beginning to interact with some of the Muslim Christian groups around how one does this. Now, in those classrooms, they're focusing not just on the common ground, okay? I don't know if you noticed, but the cover of my book is actually a Venn diagram. There are 2 circles intersecting here. So in the classroom, they're doing the common ground, but they are also doing the important differences, the parts that don't overlap. And they're talking about the points of historical interconnection between, in this case, Judaism and Christianity. Some of those points of connection have been inspiring, and some of them have been tragic, but they're all important, and they all fed into the coevolution of these 2 religions. And that's not something that you're going to easily get in a single faith religious education program, is that ability to look at those connections. and also the ability to talk to the children about their own interfaith identities as they evolve. Now, I wanted to go beyond stories and anecdotes, although stories, of course, are powerful, as Eileen was referring to. I was looking for statistics, for data on this, and there was none. And part of the reason for that is that most of the studies on interfaith families have been done by institutions and funders with a particular religious agenda. And so, not that I am completely objective, I have my own agenda, which is perhaps to put a more positive spin on interfaith families. Some would say I look through rose-colored glasses. That's my experience. I can't get away from that, but at least I'm being upfront about it. So I did my own surveys. I did an anonymous survey of 250 parents who put their children into these interfaith education programs, asking them in part, why are you doing this? It's got to be harder than just picking one religion. Everyone's telling you not to do both. Why are you doing both? And then I did an anonymous survey of 50 teens and young adults who had been through these programs. And this is really the first portrait that we have of the education. And I'm not going to take you through the results. You can read the book. But very briefly, I found the vast majority of them felt that their parents had made a good decision to educate them in both religions. The vast majority said that they were not confused, and that's been a traditional objection to the idea of doing both. The majority felt comfortable in both churches and synagogues. And this was a stated goal of many of the parents and the programs, that they wanted the children to feel comfortable in both. Because inevitably, you're going to go to your cousin's bar mitzvah, and you're going to go to your other cousin's confirmation. And we want those children to feel comfortable in those spaces. And finally, the majority wanted to raise their own children with interfaith education. Now, we'll get back to that. But the question people always ask me is, well, how did they end up, right? I can't tell you that. And there's several reasons why. One is that none of us end up, right? We're all journeying, until the day we die, and perhaps afterwards, who knows? Pew Research has documented this tremendous rate of religious flexibility and fluidity. People changing affiliations, people leaving religions, people attending more than one house of worship. And these aren't people in interfaith families. This is everybody in America. So, another reason I can't tell you how they end up is that at the time I was surveying and interviewing them, these children were between 13 and 30. So if you remember Rainn Wilson last night talking about his rebellion phase between, say, 18 and 30, well, everybody goes through that. A lot of people do. So these kids were in the midst of that. So I would hesitate to say, yes, 10% have chosen this and 20% have chosen that, because by the time my book came out, they'd probably moved on and done something else. But I will tell you that there were young people who chose to be Jewish, who chose to be Protestant, who chose to be Catholic or Quaker or Buddhist, who made clear choices. So the idea that they'll never be able to choose once given an interfaith education, I found to be without merit. But the vast majority of them still, at this point, young point, maintain their bothness. In other words, they saw no reason to deselect one or the other ancestral family religion. They still saw more benefit to keeping both than to choosing one. Now, some of them did talk about the possibility of choosing in the future, not choosing between the parents, which has been a traditional objection to this, that the children will feel the pressure to choose between the parents. Instead, by the time they're teenagers, they're saying, I might choose someday in conjunction with my spouse or partner. But it wasn't always what you think. So some of them said, yeah, if my partner's Protestant, maybe I'll be a Protestant. But others said, if my partner's Protestant, then I want to bring Judaism to the family. So they were looking to replicate and pass forward the very positive interfaith family and interfaith educational experience that they had, which is not something that I think people would have imagined. Now, I wish I could have brought a group of these young people with me on a panel. Maybe we'll do that next time. But instead, I'm going to just very briefly read to you from the chapter called Interfaith Children Grow Up, where I paint portraits of these young people who've had this interfaith education. And I'm going to introduce you to Matthew Kolakowski. That's his real name. He's a real guy. And I'm proud of the fact that this book is filled with real people using their real names. Because a lot of the previous literature had been filled with composites and anonymous anecdotes, in part because people still felt very fraught about their interfaith families and they were ashamed, or they didn't want their in-laws to know that they had baptized the baby, or whatever the problems were. Almost everybody I talked to was willing to go on the record, which I think is interesting, and particularly these young people. So Matthew, at the time I interviewed him, was a college student in Chicago. His mother is Jewish, his father's Catholic. And he was educated in the Interfaith Family School in Chicago. And what's interesting about that program, it's one of the big ones I was talking about, over 100 kids, is that it's specifically Catholic and Jewish. Because that's the history of who got intermarried in Chicago. You had, immigrant neighborhoods side by side, people met at work, at university, got married. And what's really interesting about the Chicago programs is that they have had tremendously positive support from clergy, both Jewish and Catholic, in that Chicago area, who recognized that these were families who were going to get married, who were going to raise their children with both, and they might as well support them in that. So Matthew had a first communion with a classroom filled with interfaith kids, and the rabbi came and said a blessing at the first communion. I know. Are you feeling uncomfortable yet? Raise your hand if you're uncomfortable. He then had a bar mitzvah, and his Catholic priest came and said a blessing at the bar mitzvah. I mean, this kind of blows my mind, because in Washington area, we don't have that kind of depth of clergy interaction and support. But what's interesting in this case was that at around the time of his bar mitzvah, Matthew began to feel that he wanted to choose Judaism as his religion. And he says, but then he attended Catholic confirmation classes even after his bar mitzvah. And what he says is, I wanted to try to make sure that my hunch was correct, that I was doing the right thing. By the time he was 16, he felt confident in his decision. He says, I feel even closer to the religion I ended up going with because I was able to choose it. I didn't see it as choosing between parents. I saw it as a lifelong decision I would have to live with, and I knew that my parents would support me either way. That's key. He says, it's a really important decision, and it shouldn't be made on other people's agendas. But when he thinks about raising children, he still feels drawn, as do virtually all of the children raised with both, to the type of interfaith education he experienced. He says, I'm really happy with the education I received, and I'd really like to pass that on if I could. It's almost a shame if I marry someone of the same religion. As you've probably figured out by now, I think interfaith education is particularly powerful and important for people with interfaith families, to understand your ancestry. My children, for instance, have a great-great-grandfather who was an itinerant rabbi on the Mississippi River in the 19th century. They also have a great-great-grandfather who was an Episcopal bishop of Newark, New Jersey. Now, I wanted them to know those stories and to understand what a rabbi is and to understand what a bishop is, and that requires a certain amount of interfaith education. But I also think it's obvious, particularly to everybody in this room, I think, at Claremont Lincoln, that all of us who are Americans would benefit from more interfaith education. And this is a hot issue in our country because of the separation of church and state, which I deeply value and understand. The interpretation of that has been that we do not do any world religions education in public schools. Now, there's an issue, I was talking with Seth last night about, well, if we did do it in public schools in areas that are still 100% Christian, how would we know what's being taught? And there's a lot of issues there, but it's interesting to think about the fact that in the United Kingdom, they have a completely opposite perspective where interfaith education is actually required in government-funded schools. And if you're a government-funded religious school, say Christian, you can do a certain percentage of your religious education in Christianity, but you have to also do interfaith education. So, I mean, it's just something to think about. People from interfaith families, people like me, people like Matthew, whether we affiliate ultimately with one religion or two or none or all, or we pick a third religion, my point here is that we have particular skills in interfaith communication and activism. Skills that are cultivated through growing up with 24/7 interfaith immersion. Unfortunately, I think we often feel discouraged from talking about our interfaith families in the course of official interfaith dialogue because our religious ambiguity makes others uncomfortable. So we end up with these two parallel worlds. We have interfaith dialogue and activism and leadership training over here, and we have the world of interfaith families over there. And there's been a kind of a wall. And what I'm trying to do is bring them together, connect them up, because there are synergies. Because I think people from interfaith families could lend skills that would be helpful to interfaith dialogue and activism. I've been very impressed with how interfaith leadership training has expanded to include the secular, humanist, and agnostic and atheist viewpoints. I mean, that has been a very successful effort, and I think that interfaith dialogue or interbelief dialogue, or whatever we want to then call it, has benefited from expanding that table. And I'm sort of trying to follow in their footsteps, to expand that table again, to have the experiences of interfaith families acknowledged and, you know, used in that dialogue. Because I think, especially right now, here at Claremont Lincoln and elsewhere, we're at this moment where we are developing the curricula for interfaith studies, for interfaith activism, for interfaith leadership. And I really want to see interfaith families included in those curricula. Because among young students now, it's going to be a very large percentage of your students who have these experiences and who want to bring these experiences. And to discourage them from bringing those experiences, I think, would be a waste. I've crisscrossed the country speaking this past year, having these uncomfortable conversations. And I find a lot of people over the age of, say, 40, and I include myself in that, are made very uncomfortable by this idea of interfaith education for interfaith kids. And a lot of the people under age, say, 30, find that it's very natural and organic. And they'll sometimes ask me, well, why did you even have to write a book about this? It's kind of obvious. Well, it's not yet obvious to religious institutions. But because people under 30 are more and more disengaged from those institutions, they don't really understand why this is such a big deal. But as those millennials and Gen Xers come into positions of leadership, faculty positions, leadership positions, they're going to bring with them those interfaith family experiences and their constructed complex religious identities and, you know, the blurring of boundaries between humanism and spirituality and all of this complexity. And to me, that's a good thing. Because I think in the 21st century, our ideas about race, religion, culture, gender, no longer fit into those black and white boxes. We are all creating both and identities rather than either or identities. That is not to say that we are post-religious any more than we're post-racial, but it is to say that we need to recognize single faith privilege as well as Christian privilege as we go forward into this very fluid and flexible religious landscape together. I see people with interfaith education, whether they're interfaith children or whether they're people who study at Claremont Lincoln, those people with that education are a kind of a glue that binds together religious communities sitting side by side so that we can understand what we share as human beings and what our differences are. and so that we can reduce the toll of religious misunderstanding, intolerance, and violence, which we all experienced yet again this week. If all of us go out and claim the diversity and complexity of our own identities, of our immediate families, of our communities at large, this can only help to create a more just and peaceful world. Thank you.